Good morning. I love seeing baptisms in this church, especially I got to teach the high school group in the fall, and Jason was in the group. He's one of the D group leaders there. So seeing him get baptized was awesome. Yesterday I was sitting there in church computing. Yesterday was my wife's 38th anniversary of getting baptized, becoming a Christian. It's easy to remember because it's Valentine's Day. And I don't know if I've told the story before, but I met Priscilla at the University of Michigan, and she kind of invited her to InterVarsity. She got involved, and that's how she became a Christian. And she comes from a very strict, what's called Old Regular Baptist. So think of it as Christian Amish. You can't cut your hair, you can't wear makeup, women have to wear dresses. Very kind of strict in terms of its interpretation. So anyway, the church we went to did the baptisms in the evenings. This was a Sunday evening. And Sunday evenings, which I didn't really anticipate, they tend to let the youth run it. So there was people on stage with electric guitars, and the worship music was very loud. And we invited her parents. And her parents were petrified. They were totally freaking, totally white. And they did not know what to think of this. And I think for the first 10 years of our marriage, they always sort of questioned who my daughter married. I can't believe, he would take her to a church like this. So, still trying to dig out of that hole. But fortunately, I think they accept me today. Okay, so let's dig in. We're halfway through. This is week 5. And we're looking at biblical archaeology. And last week we talked about the Exodus, right? So, we talked about basically the people being led out of Egypt and Mount Sinai and the covenant that God made with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. And it was a contract, as we sort of mentioned at the end of last week. Deuteronomy, in particular, has the exact same structure as an ancient Near East contract. It's kind of fascinating when you compare the two. So even though, this wasn't it's not like they were trying to take over Hittite or Canaanite culture, the point was the people of Israel knew they were making a contract with God to be his holy people, but God had requirements of them as well. The difference, of course, is, the contracts that we have from that time were different nations trying to be at peace with one another. This is obviously different because the people of Israel, this was how the people of Israel would be at peace with God. So kind of different in terms of what it meant, but very similar in terms of the structure and what they would have recognized. So this week we're going to talk about the Conquest. So, if we kind of go through the Bible, Genesis is creation, and then the story of the patriarchs. We talked about that week 1. Exodus, of course, is the story of the Israelites. Starts out with them in captivity and ends up with them out of captivity in the wilderness, Mount Sinai. And then obviously Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy are the law and the story of them wandering around for 40 years before they entered the Promised Land. So that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Joshua is the story of them coming into the Promised Land. Under Joshua's leadership, Moses wasn't allowed to sort of go into the Promised Land and lead them into the Promised Land. So Joshua was selected to do that by God. The biblical account is very straightforward, right? They essentially crossed the Jordan after conquering a couple of folks on the eastern side of the Jordan River, the Moabites and the Ammonites. And they came into the Promised Land, sacked a couple of cities, and then over a relatively long period of time, started kind of conquering different cities, different tribes, essentially pushing people out of the Promised Land, and ended up ultimately with Joshua allocating the country of Israel to the different tribes as he went. There are, as you've kind of picked up in this class, there's modern archaeologists who try and dispel the Bible, and many of them take issue with the biblical account. The reason they take issue with the biblical account is not so much the overall framework of Joshua leading the people of Israel out of Egypt, or Moses, and then into the Promised Land, because there's a lot of evidence for that. They take issue with sort of are the biblical writers telling the whole truth? And what I mean by that is, the argument is basically if a big group of foreign people are basically going to come into a country, conquer the entire country, we should have a lot more archaeological evidence than we do. But if you read and study the book of Joshua, you realize that that statement isn't really accurate. First of all, the people of Israel were not strangers to this area. They originally came from the area before they were enslaved in Egypt. And they weren't also new. They wandered around for 40 years in the Canaan area, the greater area, before they came into the area that they did. So it's not like they were a totally foreign people. They were obviously familiar with, a lot of the land, a lot of the cultures, having been, 40 years wandering around before they came in. The other thing that's, I think, very important when you study the biblical account is they didn't really, there were only 3 cities that they actually destroyed. The Bible, God asked them to destroy these cities, and that was Jericho, Ai, and Hazor. Those are the 3 cities that basically they sacked, they burned, and we have archaeological evidence to that effect. The rest of them, they essentially pushed the people out. They kept the cities though, right? They didn't want the whole thing at this point is you don't want to rebuild cities. It takes a lot of effort. So better to push the people out and take over the city, which is essentially what happened. What's the last city? We're going to talk about all 3 of them today. Okay. Hazor, Ai, Hazor, and Jericho. So that's essentially what we have. The other thing, like I said, is they're not a new population. They knew, like I said, they knew the area. They were in the area for 40 years. People knew they were there, and that's essentially what they got. So the overall story of Joshua that's we can absolutely sort of confirm, and nobody essentially disagrees with, is the people of Israel came into Canaan. They used some military force and knocked over and burned and destroyed 3 cities. And then they coexisted with the Canaanites, much to God's chagrin, right? God basically told them to expel the people, and they didn't do the best job in the world of that. And it was really only under David and Solomon where they essentially controlled what you would now know of as the land of Israel. So 3 things we're going to look at today are documents that essentially confirm what we know of as the Conquest. We'll look at the 3 cities that were sacked and the excavations that we have. And then also the people groups. The Bible mentions a lot of people groups, Canaanites, Hittites, Philistines, etc. And we'll talk about 3 of those today, because I think it's fascinating in terms of the evidence. And again, a lot of this evidence, as I sort of throw out the dates, are all in the last 100 years or so. Some of them in the last 50 years. There's been a lot of archaeological discoveries in the area, mainly as a result of the Zionist movement and Israel becoming a nation in 48, that give us a lot of this archaeological evidence. The first I want to point out, though, is what's called the Merneptah stele. So stele meaning it's basically a big monument. This thing's 10 feet tall in terms of its size. And it's a Egyptian monument written in hieroglyphics. And it was discovered in 1896 in the city of Thebes. And it basically goes back to 1209 BC. So 10-foot monument, tells a bunch of stories of Pharaoh Merneptah, and basically, like I said, we can date it to within 2 or 3 years of 1209 BC. We talked about previous weeks, the Exodus happened about 1450 BC, 40 years wandering in the wilderness, so now we're at like 1410 BC in terms of likely when Joshua came in. So this is with sort of 100, 150 years after the people of Israel came into the Promised Land. And it says this on this tombstone, this monument. It says, Canaan has been plundered. This is typical of what you see in pharaohs. They're always bragging about their conquests, right? So you kind of have to take everything, understanding the context. Canaan has been plundered into every sort of woe. Ashkelon has been overcome. Gezer has been captured. Yonam is made non-existent. And Israel is laid waste, and its seed, meaning the grain, is no more. The interesting thing about this is the first reference we have to the people of Israel at the time. So we don't have any documentation about them coming into the Promised Land, but we can absolutely date the fact that the people of Israel were in that area by 1209 BC, which is, again, kind of what we would expect if they left, if they kind of crossed in the Jordan around 1410. Remember, our dates go backwards because we're BC. 1410, this is kind of 200 years later, and it basically confirms that Israel's in the land at that time. The other interesting thing here is it doesn't use, the way the context in the name Israel that they use here is describing a people group. It's not describing a nation. The reason that's important is because they weren't a nation. They were a people group wandering around, nomadic. They had sacked a couple cities. These were a bunch of, kind of tribal states around Palestine at the time. But this wasn't under the monarchy. This was not under David Solomon. So what you would expect is basically, a people group kind of wandering around, expanding, but not an actual country. Yes, sir?
Any speculation on what the population might have been of this group of Israelites?
That's a whole separate question. Christians disagree on the number. Christians and secular people disagree on the number. They disagree when the numbers are given in the book of Exodus. Are they tribes? Are they people? Are they men? Are they women? So the answer to the question in the Christian community is not really. I think we'll spend more time on that in one of the subsequent weeks. But
aren't most of the indications in Exodus or wherever where they talk about the size of the tribes, aren't they only counting the men?
Yeah, the numbers range from 300,000 men to 3 million of the population that came out of Egypt. That's, like I said, the range, and people hotly debate this topic. This is one of these things that it's just very hard for people to kind of put their fingers on. So I've read scholars I love on the low side. I've read scholars I love on the high side, and I'm not smart enough to decide between the two. So
that's the topic of how long did the Lord hold the Red Sea open for? 80 million people to cross?
Well, this is the question, right? So the question, I'm going to repeat it because there's folks on the video. How long did he keep the Red Sea open as they crossed? 3 million people is an awful lot of people to get through the Red Sea. It's also an incredible number of people to be wandering around camping. 3 million is a very, very large number, which is why, like you said, some people argue the 300,000 number is more accurate, but then you get into the question of 300,000 families, 300,000 men, which means it was bigger because you have women and children, and that's where the debate comes in. So, again, this is important. Earliest mention we have of the word Israel. The second thing I want to talk about is what's called the Amarna letters. This is fascinating because this is 1887 in Egypt. A woman is basically, plowing in the dirt, and basically starts hitting some lumps of hard clay. And she starts to pick them up and thinks they're totally worthless. Somebody looks at them and realizes that this was absolutely priceless artifacts. These are what are called cuneiform. So this is small impressions in clay, right? And what she discovered was 382 letters that were sent from the people groups in the Canaan area to the Egyptian pharaoh asking for help. This is fascinating. Some of these, by the way, are like 2 inches by 2.5 inches. The largest one is 3.5 by 9.5 inches. Fairly typical of these letters. Again, we don't have huge scrolls and parchment. They end up making these letters and then they ship them off. But these are basically subject kings. So again, Israel at this point are a bunch of city-states run by local kings. They're all under essentially similar to how Israel was in the days of Rome and Jesus. All sort of under the control of Egypt in the sense that they had to pay taxes to Egypt, right? So most of the time, Pharaoh comes in, they conquer him. What do they really want? They want tax revenue. So they say, I'm going to leave you alone. You send me your taxes, whatever, 10, 20%. We're going to call it good. So what you see in these letters, and the importance of this is critical, is these are letters describing the political conditions at the time. And they describe basically a group of people called the Habaru that are menacing the city-states inside of Israel. Habaru, most scholars are going to argue, is synonymous with the word Hebrew. So this is, like I said, these folks in the Philistine, Canaanites, other regions, basically writing to the Egyptian king asking for help. We're getting sacked, people are harassing us, these people are taking over, we need your help, send troops, basically is what these are. And the interesting thing is, one of the tablets, 287, records, the prince of Jerusalem sent desperate news to Egypt that many of the officials in Jerusalem had joined with the Habaru, and the lands of the king of Egypt were lost to the enemies. Of course, we know from the Bible, the Hebrews came in, they basically conquered Jerusalem, and then they made that their capital. So we have very good kind of confirming evidence from these tablets that the Hebrews were in the region at the time, and that they were harassing the people, they were sacking a bunch of cities, and they're asking for help. The other fascinating thing about this is it confirms a lot of the historical detail of the Old Testament. So it talks about places, it talks about kings, it talks about basically geography. I'm the king of this, So we have a lot of the names and geographic markers in the Old Testament have been confirmed through these letters, which has been, like I said, kind of a massive archaeological discovery that kind of supported the biblical account. So many letters, so many different kings, and basically confirming kind of the events. Yeah, sorry, Ross.
Is there more than one author, and what period of times were they written?
Oh yeah. So this is think of this as the post office in Egypt. So all these different kings, or kings meaning city-state kings, sending off letters saying help, help. So yes, these are different authors. I don't know how many unique different authors, but let's say dozens of different authors writing. The find is in Egypt. So wherever this thing was stored, they basically found these and somebody kind of collected them, right? Whoever the main scribe was communicating to Pharaoh, this was the repository, right? So that's why it's so fascinating is it was not just one person. This is so many different people writing, basically asking for help at the time.
When was the time?
The date? That is a good question. I don't have the date from when it dates to, is probably a good question. It was discovered in 1887, but I don't know, like I said, over a period of time. But let's go, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have that written down. Okay, and then the other interesting thing is we have an Egyptian record. I don't think I have a picture of it, but it's an Egyptian record of a scribe that traveled throughout the land of Canaan during this time. So it was, this one I do have the date written down for, between 1417 and 1379 BC. So again, 1400 roughly is when they came into the Promised Land. So this is within the first 100 years. And the scribe basically boasts of his knowledge of the local language, and he writes it in Hebrew. So again, another confirming evidence, we know that the Hebrews were in the land at the time. And he mentions meeting with, quote, the chief of Asher. Asher is one of the 12 tribes of Egypt. So this would be him meeting with the tribal leader of the tribe of Asher. And then the most interesting thing about this, and it's basically a story of his travels. This is one part of it, but it's a story of his travels throughout Canaan that then gets recorded for the Pharaoh. He records an encounter with local Bedouin. Some of them were 7 to 9 feet high. And, quote, fierce of face is what he describes them. Of course, this is interesting because we know from the Bible, again, depending upon how you interpret the cubits, and there's arguments on that, but Goliath was essentially 7 to 9 feet, in that range. And Goliath was from Gaza, which would have been on the route that he would have taken from basically Egypt up through kind of the coastal area and into Palestine. So at least one confirmation, we'll talk more about David and Goliath in a subsequent week, about not only the Hebrews existed in the land very early on at this period, that he met with one of the tribes, the tribe of Asher, and that there were these really tall giants in the area, which is, I think, just totally fascinating. Okay, so now let's talk about the three cities. Jericho, Joshua comes into the Promised Land, and basically the first city they sack is Jericho. And we actually have excavations of what's called Tel Jericho. Again, the word tel means big mound of dirt. Big mound of dirt that, again, there's a wall around it. And essentially, when cities got sacked, they would just build in place, rebuild the walls, etc. So you end up with these mounds, these things called tels throughout it. So there's been several excavations in Jericho, the first city that they sacked. And there's kind of universal agreement on four things. One is there were significant quantities of grain discovered. And I'll talk about why that's important in a second. It was destroyed by a violent fire because there's about 3 feet thick layer of ash and char, essentially burned out buildings, underneath the tell, right? So that if they dig down, they can sort of see that layer. So it was destroyed by fire. The stone walls on the outside collapsed, which is significant, of course, given the biblical account. And there's very solid archaeological evidence that homes were built into the walls, which I'll talk about in a second. But if you have the handout with the Bible verses, I want to read from Joshua 6, verse 20. It says, "So the people shouted, and the trumpets were blown." Just to set the context, for those of you who don't know the story, Joshua comes in. God says, hey, let's do this a unique way. Let's just march around the city each day for 6 days, and then kind of go home and pitch our tents. And then on the seventh day, this is what happens. God commands them to march around the city and then shout. And he says, so the people shouted and the trumpets were blown. And as soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout and the walls fell flat down. So that the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they captured the city. And they devoted all the city to destruction, both men and women, young and old, oxen and sheep and donkeys, all with the edge of the sword. And then in verse 24, and they burned the city with fire and everything in it. Only the silver and gold and the vessels of bronze, of iron, they put into the treasury of the house of the Lord. So the biblical account is this. There was not a long siege. And most times, if anyone had been to Masada in Israel? Okay, so Masada is basically a well-protected fortress. It took the Romans 3.5 years to sack Masada because it was so well protected. So typically what happened, and we saw this in Hezekiah's time, we saw it several times in the Old Testament, an army comes in, they basically, lift up the gates, close the gates, and they basically then, there's a 1, 2, 3 year siege until somebody like, in the case of Nebuchadnezzar, he comes in and he sacks Jerusalem. In this case, what's fascinating is this was this wasn't a siege. This was very quick. And the reason we know is because there are many pots of grain that are still there. And usually in a siege what happens is you eat up all the food and then people basically die of hunger before they surrender. That's very common. Or if they get sacked, what happens? The invading army takes the grain. Grain here is like money, right? Not easy to grow grain, takes a lot of effort, big armies. So the fact that grain is sitting there and in pots all around this city says that it was sacked very quickly by the invading army, and the invading army did not take the grain. Significant because the Old Testament tells us that Joshua was commanded by God, don't take anything, burn the whole city. Again, except for the gold which they put into the treasury. But this is very unique in archaeology. There's no other case where we have a city where the grain was intact. There are pots of grain all over the city. Very unique. So kind of very interesting in terms of confirming the biblical account. The other thing that's fascinating about Jericho is there were houses built into the walls. So if you look over here, houses were built right up against the walls in Jericho because building a house was hard. You had to move rocks, right? So if you already have one wall already built, it's easier to build 3 walls than 4 walls. So what you end up with are houses in this site. You can see there's little windows outside the houses in Jericho, but they were built right up against the walls because it was easier. And of course, this is significant because in the Old Testament story, Joshua sent spies into the city. Rahab the prostitute was basically welcomed, I don't say welcomed, but accepted the spies into her home on the condition and protected them on the condition that they save her life when they sack the city. right? So she lets down a scarlet rope out of the window, and you can easily see in one of these houses how that could be done to identify which was her house. In the excavation, we actually have, this is the wall over here, you can see the house is built right up into the wall. So we don't know if this is Rahab's house, but I mean, there's not like there's thousands of these things. So could very well be the one next to it or whatever. But it's fascinating because, like you said, the archaeological evidence here that the Bible gives us thousands of years, here we are 4,000 years later, that house is built into the walls, and this is exactly what we found in Jericho that matches the biblical description, which I love. The next city that they sacked was Ai. And this was another one burnt. If you have the handout, we'll read from Joshua 8. It says, "The Lord said to Joshua, do not fear and do not be dismayed. Take all the fighting men with you and arise and go up to Ai. See, I have given them into your hand, the king of Ai and his people and the city and his land." And then in verse 8, "And as soon as you have taken the city, you shall set the city on fire, and you shall do all according to the word of the Lord. See, I have commanded you." And then in verse 28, "So Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins, as it is to this day." If any of you have studied this, this is a wonderful account of battle strategy that God basically gives to Joshua. Because what God tells him to do is have your army march up to the wall, start to attack, they start to repel the attack, and then the Israelis hightailed and ran toward the wilderness, and then the men of Ai, the fighting army, left the city to go chase after them. But what they didn't know is half the army was lying in ambush, and they basically then came in and sacked the city and burned it. And then the army that was fleeing turned around and started engaging, and the 12,000 men of Ai, fighting men, all were slaughtered on the battlefield because they have Hebrews on both sides. So from a battle strategy, it's just brilliant, right? You got to give God amazing credit for coming up with that battle strategy.
Is that called flanking?
Well, yes. But the interesting thing is, like I said, they knew that the people would all leave the city, right? So usual flanking, they just come around the backside. But in this case, they took the city, torqued it, and then they had nowhere back to run to. So anyway, so very, very cool. The interesting thing about this is the traditional site of Ai doesn't match the biblical account. There's no sort of what you would expect, charring or anything like that in terms of the layers, which has led many people to conclude that the biblical account wasn't right. But more recently, there's been excavation at a site called Khirbet el Magater that's been excavated, and it shows basically the gates of the cities being burnt, which we know the biblical account confirms because they took the king of Ai, hung him on the city gate, and torqued the whole place. So it's quite possible this is a case where we actually have the wrong location traditionally where scholars thought that it was, is not where it actually was. Of course, we don't have Google Maps from 4,000 years ago. And when you excavate a site, it doesn't say, "Welcome to Ai" on the outside of the building. So this happens occasionally where they get the wrong city. I suspect this is, what we have here is kind of the wrong location of the city. But anyway, more excavations are going on. It'll be fascinating to see what happens there. And then finally we get to Hazor in Joshua 11. And it says this, "And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck the king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all his kingdoms. And they struck the sword with all who were in it, devoting them to destruction, and there was nothing left that breathed, and they burned Hazor with fire." This site, Hazor, was discovered in 1955 to 1969 is when it was excavated, so relatively recently. We do have evidence of the fire layer, so the charring that goes across the site. We do know the city was destroyed by fire. The interesting thing about Hazor, though, is we actually have a bunch of the cuneiform tablets and other Bronze Age artifacts, so we do actually know this was Hazor. Right? We know exactly where this was, the king and things like that. So we have pretty good confirmation on that, which is great.
The text is the same as the last slide.
Is it really? You know, I'm not perfect. I make mistakes. Copy and paste error. Sorry.
What burns when the city is so much stone?
Well, yeah. I mean, so keep in mind. Of course, there's going to be wood. There's going to be fabric and whatever else, right? So much like today, when you burn a house, the fireplace is still there. Everything else around it sort of burns. So. Yeah, so it wasn't 100%. I mean, there's even when the temple burnt, right? You still have a bunch of evidence of it. So.
Like the roofs, like probably wood.
Yeah, the roofs are probably thatch roofs, right? We know from sort of the New Testament accounts, right? So yeah, there's plenty of stuff that would burn. Not to mention grain brought in and wooden carts or whatever else that would burn at the time. Okay, so those are kind of the three cities that they sacked, where we actually, like I said, with the exception of Ai, where the jury's still out, the other two we know for a fact kind of match the biblical account. I want to spend a little time talking about the people groups. So we have people groups mentioned in the Bible, of kings and things like that. The Hittites have always been a problem because in kind of the history for ages and ages, there was no evidence of the Hittites. So the Bible describes the Hittites 47 times. So a pretty prominent role in the Old Testament. But scholars, this was one of the main points the critics would attack, is we have absolutely no evidence these people ever existed. Until 1906. God, again, always has this wonderful sense of humor. When people kind of attack him, something gets discovered that kind of contravenes that. And this was from German explorers in the ancient city in Turkey called Boğazköy. Boğazköy, I guess you pronounce it. And what they discovered was 10,000 tablets, the Hittite Royal Library, along with statues, along with monuments to their gods. 5 temples were discovered, but 10,000 tablets, to the point where now most of what we know in Canaan at the time came out of this Royal Hittite Library. And it was completely pivotal because, again, it confirms a lot of things in the Old Testament and what it said. So among the tablets discovered, as I mentioned earlier, was a treaty between Egypt and the Hittite Empire. Basically a treaty. And again, this is the one we know matches the book of Deuteronomy sort of section by section in terms of how it's organized, how it's structured. So fascinating. Like I said, we have so much evidence now of the Hittites, it's kind of embarrassing because nowhere else do we have 10,000 tablets of anything in sort of the archaeological world.
How big were the tablets?
So the tablets typically, like I said, range from a couple inches to about a foot by 9 inches or something like that. So kind of traditional size, iPad size. Let's put it down.
Did the Hittites have a capital city, or were they in a particular region?
Yeah, so they were north of what you consider sort of the main promised land. So again, the capital city, Turkey here, which is where they found it. So they were kind of the neighbors to the north, if you will. Yes?
When it comes to the interpretation of how they can figure out what that stuff says, I mean, the Rosetta Stone doesn't cover everything, right? I mean, how did they...
Yeah, so great question. The question is, how do they interpret this, right? Who translates it? And, this is a very great question, right? Like I said, the cuneiform is basically, impressions, right? It's kind of symbols in terms of the language itself. But all of sort of the Canaanite languages, right? We know the Canaanites, the Philistines, and the Hebrews all sort of shared a common alphabet that was developed several hundred years earlier in the Egyptian part of the world. So they're all variations of the same theme. And again, I'm not a linguistic expert. Maybe there's some in the room, but they spend their whole lives studying different materials, comparing them, and ultimately are able to decipher the language. So, but yeah, they were, like I said, you get 10,000 documents, you can start trying to figure stuff out. And of course, these days with computers, you can look for keywords, frequency of keywords, translate one word, and then it gets a little bit easier to translate the second word easier to translate the third and kind of things like that. But okay, so let's talk about the Philistines. Philistines were one of Israel's fiercest enemies, as you know. During the days of David and Solomon, they were constantly being attacked. Actually, David and Saul, not Solomon. So Saul and David constantly being attacked by the Philistines, right? One of their main opponents to the west. So again, you got Hittites to the north. These guys are to the west. And of course, two of the famous people in the Bible, Delilah and Goliath, were both Philistines. The interesting thing about the Philistines is this. We don't really know where they came from. We know they were there, but Egypt records that in 1200 BC, sea peoples came from the Aegean area, so Greece. Sea peoples came on boats and then tried to invade Egypt. So we don't know where they came from. They weren't from Greece. Did they come from Germany? Did they come farther north? We don't know. Nobody knows where they came from. But the Egyptian king at the time, which was Ramses III, when they attacked him in Egypt, was so proud of the fact that he repelled them and the battle that took place. There's plenty of monuments and murals and stelas which kind of pronounce how great a job he did repelling these evil sea peoples that he had. And he enslaved a bunch of them. So a bunch of them became part of the Egyptian army that then show up later. Others, though, ended up into the land of what we now call Israel, Palestine, and they settled. They settled into sort of these 5 western cities along the coast. And those 5 cities we actually have today excavated: Ashdod, Ascalon, Ekron, Gaza, and Gath. All but Gath have been found. So 4 of the 5 we now have found. Of course, many of you know Gaza has been in the news a lot lately. This is, of course, a Philistine city. This is where Goliath and his friends came from. But anyway, so we're very confident in terms of the location of these, in terms of the Philistines. But we don't know where they came from, and we also don't know where they went. So most people sort of speculate they just kind of blended in with the other Canaanites. They built their cities over time. They've kind of blended in and disappeared. It's kind of like, of the 12 tribes of Israel, 10 of them are, quote, lost. They're not really lost. They just sort of blended in, intermarried, and they kind of like dispersed, but they didn't really disappear. It's not like they went anywhere. And then the third people group, of course, is the Canaanites. So this is a wonderful story. 1928, in Syria, so this is a Syrian farmer, thinks he hits a big stone. So he gets his ox, he tries to move the stone, finally pushes out of the way. What he finds is a passageway to a forgotten city. This would be cool, like you're in your backyard, you like move a rock, and there's like a whole hidden city there. The city he discovers was Ugarit, if I pronounce that right, Ugarit, that was unearthed, and it was flourishing in the days of the Canaanites. And we know this is a Canaanite place. This is where the city and the royal palace were, and they've basically found hundreds of clay tablets and more than 1,500 Ugaritic, pronounce this right, Ugaritic tablets written in the Canaanite tongue. And the most interesting thing about this is it gave us a lot of insight into the culture of the Canaanites. Again, we had the biblical accounts, but now you have the other accounts, right? You get the opposite side of the story of the Canaanites. And, the Bible references this a lot, right? It references people like Baal and the Asherah poles and things like that. And to us, it's kind of like, okay, foreign gods, got it, bad. But you don't really realize, and I think this is where the context really matters here, is that when God commanded Joshua to come into the promised land, he told him to basically wipe out the people that were there, which many of us kind of have a hard time with. But now we have a lot more context about the Canaanite culture. We know, for instance, that child sacrifice was very prominent. Excavations in a temple near Amman, Jordan, of the Canaanites, had a very large number of human bones and children that were burned. This was a fire cult, and they sacrificed babies to the fire cult by throwing them in the fire. One scholar wrote this, which I thought was fascinating. He says, the amazing thing about the gods as they were conceived in Canaan is that they had no moral character whatsoever. In fact, their contact was on a much lower level than society as a whole. Worship of these gods carried some of the most demoralizing practices that ever existed. Among them were child sacrifices, a practice long before discarded in Egypt, in Babylon, sacred prostitution, and snake worship on a scale unknown to other people. Of course, books and books of the Bible are prophets condemning these practices, right? And telling the people of Israel, don't get involved with these. Don't mix with the people. God wanted to keep them holy. In the Bible, or in Canaanite culture, we now know, the god was called El. His wife was Asherah, and her symbol was the pole. So whenever you hear Asherah poles in the Old Testament, and you're like, what in the world are these? And rip them down, and then, like, especially if you read Joshua or Judges, which is just the most depressing book in the world. Because you read it, and it's like, oh, then a bad king came to power, and he basically started practicing all the pagan worship again. And then a good king, and he tore down all the Asherah poles and destroyed all the high places. And then a bad king. And they just keep going back and forth between bad kings and good kings. And this is, like I said, we have a lot more context here. We also know now that El's wife, so El and Asherah had a child, which is Baal. And we know Baal, of course, from the stories of Elijah and the story of kind of God and Baal, which are kind of pervasive throughout that Old Testament. And of course, Israel refused to completely destroy him as God said, which led to them constantly falling into sin over and over and over again. Which, of course, brings up the point I want to end on, and that is, how do we deal with this fact that God asked the Israelis to go destroy all the men, women, and children? You'll notice when we read the passage, I think it was on AI, we're talking about nothing that breathed was left alive. They killed the donkeys. They killed, the dogs, the puppies. They killed the, men, women, and children. And I think we really struggle with that. And if, we read from Deuteronomy on the list, this is the instruction that Moses gives before they go into the promised land. And he says, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God commanded. So Joshua struck the whole land, the hill country, the Negeb, the lowland from the slopes, and all their kings. He left nothing remaining, but devoted to destruction all that breathed, just as the Lord God had commanded. Which sounds great, but as you know, over time, they continued to let the people that they pushed out of the cities, they ended up intermarrying with them, and ended up committing sin against God. So God orders this mass genocide against the people as he goes in. But he also gives us, Moses tells us, the reason for it. People struggle with this. I've read books on this. But God gives us the reason. In Deuteronomy 9, verse 5, he says, not because of your righteousness or your uprightness of heart are you going to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of these nations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you, and that he may confirm his word that the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So what we see here is the sin of the people had gotten so bad that God decided to destroy them. And this kind of goes back to the theme that we see recurringly, right? Angels rebel when they were first created, and God decides to create the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, start over, have a good relationship. They sin against him so bad that by the time of Noah, God decides, I'm going to destroy the whole world with the flood, which he does. And as Ryan talked about today, he says, at the end of it, I'm never going to destroy the world with the flood again. But then the people sin grievously again, Tower of Babel, the whole story. And then he selects Abraham, I'm going to have a special relationship with you. Just like Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, they got so sinful. God said, the story, if there's even 5 or 10, will you save the city? And God says, yes, I will. But they couldn't even find 5 or 10 in the city. They were that evil. And here we see from archaeology, we know now how evil the Canaanite culture was. I mean, We're not much better, of course. We've got abortion. We've got a whole bunch of other sins today. But imagine having babies and throwing them in the fire. I mean, how evil is that? How pervasive just the sin is, the prostitution that we see in that Canaanite culture. So again, here we see God purging the land so that he can start with his people and have a right relationship with them. And all the laws that he gives them, these crazy laws about you have to dress differently, you have to eat differently, no shellfish or oysters, that kind of thing. It's all to make sure that they're separate, that they're different from the Canaanites, the Philistines, and all the other folks that are basically kind of, embraced in sin at the time. Yeah.
So it begs the question, or it's worth just being in awe, that this was a supernatural victory, that this people group, Joshua, could go in and eliminate all of these people. And that would take massive arms, massive people to do this. And was it happening consecutively? Did it happen over time? And logistically, you would think, oh, no, these Joshua folks would be all decimated because they couldn't do it all at once. So it was a divine intervention. It was angel armies. It would have to been supernatural. God decimated them through these people, through Joshua and the people. Mm-hmm. And what a sight that must have been.
Yeah.
If you think about it. We just read over that and think, oh, yeah, okay, they were all destroyed. All the ice were destroyed, right? Mm-hmm. But how many of them, and what would it take to eliminate those people? Mm-hmm. Blows your mind.
Right.
Anyway, that's all.
Well, and again, God's got a sense of humor, because you see multiple times in the Old Testament where, David and Joshua, they're about to sack a city. And God says, no, you got too many people. Send fewer. Yeah. Right? Go to the river, and whoever laps up the water like a dog, okay, take them, but throw away all the other people. Because you have too many people that people are going to think it's because you had a strong army, and it wasn't because of me. And you see this time and time again, right? My favorite story, I don't know, I'm trying to remember the name of the city, but where basically they're afraid they're going to die, and God opens up the eyes, and they see the angelic armies behind them. What was the name of the city they were going after? Does anyone remember? Okay.
No. Not Nineveh.
Okay. Anyway, I'll have to look up. But again, he gives us a glimpse of the spiritual warfare that was going on here. This was not a case where overwhelming force came in and destroyed these cities. This is a case where God gave them these cities and God helped them. And again, even Jericho. It's Joshua's probably sitting there, well, let's create a battle plan. God's like, here's my battle plan. Walk around the city and blow trumpets. I'm sorry, God, seriously? That's not a battle plan. And God's like, nope, I'm going to show you. I want the glory to go to me, not to you. Yes. And we see this time and time again.
And we see it in modern history
with
Israel. All the wars since 1948.
Exactly.
It was impossible for the Israelis. They were just a bunch of people with hoes and at pickaxes. Mm-hmm. I mean, and they had 21 Arab nations just wanting them dead and gone. And God did all these victories. Yep. And people can't. Oh, if it's not Jews, it's not news. Mm-hmm. Now.
I know. Yeah, and I suspect, like I said, if there were a new book of the Bible to be written, the Jewish independence in 1948, the Six-Day War in 1967, God would explain how they had these overwhelming victories, given kind of overwhelming odds against them, right? And argue, well, anyway, yes. So even you would argue the battle that we just saw in the last couple of years against overwhelming forces of Iran is just kind of amazing in terms of what's happened. So, look, I've studied the Bible most of my life, and I've come to two simple conclusions. God's ways are not my ways, and I am not God. So when we get to passages like this where, God, why are you just destroying every man, woman, and children? God's ways are not our ways. God wanted to purify the land, just like he did with Sodom and Gomorrah. There's just unbelievable evil. And the thing I struggle with is, why does God have such a hang-up on sin? Why is sin so difficult for God? And of course the answer is, God's holy, and we are not. But the answer I kind of come back to is God's ways are not my ways, and I'm not God. Right? God has certain ways, and we see this with Israel rebelling time and time again. We see this throughout the whole Old Testament and even the New Testament, where people rebel against God because we want to live our way, our lives, our ways, and God has a very different plan. And I think that's what we struggle with. And this is why so many people, I was reading an article this week on why so many people reject Christ. And basically the thesis of the article has nothing to do with logic. It has nothing to do with apologetics. It has nothing to do with proof. It's all about they don't want to change their ways. That's the problem. Even people who say, I know it happened, I know Jesus was here, I know he rose from the dead, why don't you believe? The answer is, I don't want to change my life. And I think that's the fundamental struggle we have in society today, is so many people are living this life on their own, independent of God, even though they know a broader truth exists. And of course, that's why God sent his son. That's why the message, that's why evangelism is so important, is to spread that good news to folks. So let me close in prayer and then I'll take questions. Oh yeah. No, go ahead. Okay, dear God, thank you so much for this time, for your word, the evidence we have, Father, but also I pray that as we engage with people, we engage their hearts as well as their heads, Father. Christianity is true, but also people need to be open to receiving you and living for you. And I think that's our biggest challenge in terms of how we do that. So give us courage, give us faith, give us the ability, Father, to do that through changed hearts and lives. Amen. Okay, question.
I'm just curious about something. I was reading in the news in Tehran, they were burning the statue of Baal. Where do they actually worship that false god? Where did the statue come from?
So I don't know the answer to the question. What I know is, of course, Iran is Shiite, so Shiite Muslim. They don't worship Baal, right? Prophet Muhammad, one God, very clear, one God. So they are monotheistic. It's probably some. The Iranians were notable for blowing up artifacts when the Ayatollahs took over. So I suspect, again, a whole bunch of ancient relics from the Persian Empire, and they just decided to start blowing them up because, I don't know, it's kind of hard to blame them. God told the Israelites to blow up all the high places and all the Asherah poles when they came into Israel, so they're trying to purify, I guess, Iran for Muhammad and for, Allah. I suspect that's what it is, but I don't know the details. Yes, question?
When you first said, God wanted to purify the land, we're thinking about how we still behave the same way, even as believers. He wants to purify our hearts, but we tend to want to cling to things that are of this world, and the society around us, and we don't want to live separately. We want to be accepted. We want to be a part of the world that we live in. And I say that for myself when I realized, how that is. And I think as believers, we really need to think about how do we need to purify our hearts like God does, and live separately from the rest of the world.
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And again, for the video, the question is, God, wants to purify our hearts. And, why do we struggle with that? And I'll give you a couple examples, right? In the Bible, again, we have these 10 lost tribes of Israel. And again, they're not lost. They just blended in with the people to the point where they were indistinguishable from the Babylonians and the Assyrians that they were captured by. So we just don't know where they went because they just looked like everybody else. And I think that, we see the same thing here where God commands his people to do things differently because he wanted them to stick out. So I think the question to your point is, for each of us as we live our lives, do people where we work, do we stick out or do we not? Do we just blend in? Right? God wants us to live separate. That doesn't mean that, I used to be in a Bible study group, and I think I've told this before, where the people decide to all buy a compound in Ellensburg, stockpile food for the end times. God doesn't want that either, right? You look at Daniel in Babylon, he didn't blend in. He wouldn't pray to the gods. He did things differently. I'm not going to eat what you eat. I'm going to eat my own food. But he was in the culture, and he was influencing that culture. And I think that's what God's calling us to do today. We need to stand out. We need to influence the culture, but we also need to be in the culture to be salt and light. Spending time in Ellensburg where nobody knows we're there, it doesn't really help. Right? Okay, Kathy.
When the kings raised Asherah poles in the culture, how much of the practices did they practice? Were they killing babies too?
So the question is, how much of the practice of the Israelites matched what we see in Canaan? So I suspect the answer is much of it did look like the Canaanite culture. If they're sticking up, idols to Baal, and they're putting up Asherah poles, and they built the high places which are worshiping other gods, they're worshiping those other gods. Honestly, I don't know. Were they sacrificing their babies or not? But certainly they looked like the Canaanites, the Philistines at the time in terms of worshiping these false gods. But I don't know to the extent offhand that they actually were sacrificing babies.
I have a question. When they sacrificed the babies, did they slit the baby's throat? Or did they throw them alive?
Okay, I don't know the answer. I'm going to skip that. Okay, John.
Like all of us, I understand that the Jewish temple was in Jerusalem for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Who named Judea, Judea, and who named Assyria, Assyria?
Well, I assume the Assyrians named Assyria, Assyria. I don't know why.
The Assyrians were Christians, weren't they?
No. The Assyrians were not. They were a conquering empire similar to Babylon. So they came in and they conquered the northern tribes, the 10 northern tribes, took him captive into Assyria. And then Babylon came in and took the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, right? And then took them captive into Babylon.
So Assyrians were not Jews.
Assyrians were not Jews. That's correct.
Now, because let's talk about
Maybe you're confusing. Sumerians were Jews. So when the 10 tribes split, so when the 10 tribes split, which we'll get to in subsequent week, the 10 tribes split, 8 and 2. The eight on top, the northern kingdoms, built their own temple. Different than the one in Jerusalem, because they wanted their own place to worship. So, that's why they hated the Samaritans, because they had their own temple, their own ways.
Number one, thank you for correcting my sister. Number 2, how in the world is some were called Judea and the other one called Samaria, and they're now Muslim claiming?
So
I know Muslims lived in the region of Palestine.
Yep.
But these lands were named by Jewish people.
Okay, so the question is, where did they get their name? So Judea is named, of course, for Judah, which is one of the 12 tribes. Okay? So one of the 12 tribes, Judah, was much bigger than the other small, itsy-bitsy little tribe called Benjamin. So if you actually look at a map, Benjamin is a little island inside of Judah in terms of how it got allocated. And when the 10 tribes split from, the 12 tribes, I'm sorry, doing my math wrong here, right? So 8 tribes, 10 and 2, right? Sorry. The 10 tribes on the north split from the 2 tribes on the south. Judah became Judea because Benjamin was teeny and insignificant. It's the easiest way to think of it. So your next question, though, is about the Muslims. So Muhammad did not come in to his own until 600 years after Christ. So if you look at the timeline, we're at sort of 1400 BC when they come into the Promised Land. So you got 1400 years to get to the time of Christ, and then 600 years from that to get to Muhammad. Thousands of years. And then they came in and conquered into, not only Palestine, they also conquered North Africa, they conquered even parts of France and Southern Europe. So the Muslims came in, conquered, that's how they took over the Temple Mount and everything else. And then, of course, the European Christian nations freaked out, and they started the Crusades to come and basically kick them out of, not only the Holy Land, but other parts that they had conquered.
Right, so back to maps. There is no map that had a Muslim name on those lands, no state.
No.
There was Samaria, and there was Judea,
Yep.
And they were maps with Jews owning that territory, which is now the West Bank. I'm not looking for a fight in any way, but how we're not clear about that land was taken, that was named from Jews, was taken, and how they're called occupiers is absolutely mind-boggling. I'm not going down that hole, but it's mind-boggling to me. I've never seen a map with a Muslim name on both of those territories.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. In fact, the word Palestine, which is most frequently used to refer to the region today, did not exist until late 1800s, under the British Empire, when the British Empire controlled it. And that's where the word Palestine came from. Keep in mind, at the time that we're looking at here, roughly 1400 BC, there is no nation. These are city-states. So you've got, the city of Gaza, Hazor, they each own 5 or 6 cities, but there's no nation per se, right? It's only with David where you start to see a real nation with a real name on it, like Israel. And then, of course, that lasts for a while, and then they get taken over by the Assyrians and Babylonians, and then they get taken over by the Greeks, and then they get taken over by the Romans, and then they get taken over by the Muslims and the Ottomans, and then eventually the British Empire, and that's where we end up today. So this question of who owns the Holy Land, of course, is kind of a silly question. Of course, we would argue as Christians, God said, it's your land, so it's his land. But from a Muslim point of view, they would argue, Israel stole it from us because we had it under the Ottoman Empire. And then, of course, the Jews would say, well, we had it prior to that. And then, does it belong to the Romans? Does it belong to the Greeks? Does it, there's conquering nations here forever and ever. So,
I've never seen a map with
nope.
a Muslim nation state in the West Bank.
Not until the Ottomans conquered it post-Muhammad in 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries.
And it wasn't the Roman Emperor Hadrian who used that term for that area for Israel as Palestine because he was trying to not just salt the earth and get rid of the Jews, but he renamed it this Philistia, In fact, Palestinians can't even say the letter P. It's always Philistines. So, but it was a made-up name to insult Israel even further when they were dispersed.
Right. Because keep in mind, 70 AD, Jews got kicked out of Israel. So Romans basically said, no more Jews in Israel. And that's what started the diaspora, where they spread out across the world, but they were not allowed after 70 AD in that region. And that's kind of what led to the vacuum. Okay, last question. No, go ahead.
In Jeremiah, he talks about that, how God says, I told you not to do this, but you did it anyway, because they did sacrifice their children. They followed this. Just like we do.
Yeah.
There's a word in here that says wickedness, and that's why God was doing away with this particular people group. And from just looking at a dictionary definition of wickedness is actually knowing the right thing to do, but doing the other thing anyway. And so it sounds like if that were the case, God approached this people group many times.
Oh, sure.
Before he gave them over.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Like I said, God is not, incompassionate, but at some point you continue to rebel against him, there's judgment. There'll be judgment for this world, as we know, right? I mean, we'll talk about, the first sermon after Easter is we start the prophecy series. And we'll talk about why prophecy exists. And again, we tend to think like prophecy's about us. It's not about us. It's about God's plan and calling people to repentance and bringing them back into a right relationship with him. But yeah, at some point, people continue to rebel. There's judgment. And we see that at the end of Revelation as well. Okay, so on that happy note, we will conclude. Have a great week.